Charles Windsor had always believed that his marriage to Camilla was built on solid ground. After decades of public scrutiny, media storms, and personal struggles, they had finally found their rhythm together. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Clarence's house as Charles sat in his study, reviewing correspondence that had accumulated overnight. The familiar sound of Camilla's footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, accompanied by the gentle clicking of her heels against the polished floor. Their relationship had weathered countless storms. From the early days when their love affair was conducted in secrecy, through the painful years of separation, the devastating aftermath of Diana's death, and, finally, to their wedding in 2005. 20 years of marriage had taught them both the value of privacy, trust, and mutual respect. Or so Charles had thought. The autumn of 2025 had been particularly challenging for the royal family. Charles, now in his late 70s, had been dealing with increased responsibilities as the monarch, while also managing his long-standing health concerns. The weight of the crown seemed heavier with each passing day, and he had come to rely on Camilla's steady presence more than ever before. She was his anchor, his confidant, the one person who truly understood the burden he carried. Camilla had adapted remarkably well to her role as queen consort. Her natural warmth and genuine concern for others had gradually won over even the most skeptical members of the British public. She championed causes close to her heart, literacy programs, support for victims of domestic violence, and animal welfare initiatives. Her schedule was packed with engagements, charity work, and official duties that took her across the country and around the world. On this particular Tuesday morning, Charles noticed something different about his wife. She seemed distracted during breakfast, her usual animated conversation replaced by distant stares and half-hearted responses to his questions about her upcoming visit to a women's shelter in Manchester. Her phone, which typically remained silent during their meals, had buzzed several times. Each notification seemed to make her more nervous, her fingers fidgeting with her wedding ring, a habit he'd noticed developing over the past few weeks. "Everything all right, my dear?" Charles asked, setting down his morning tea and studying her face with the concern of a husband who had learned to read his wife's moods after 20 years together. Camilla looked up, startled, as if she had forgotten he was there. "Oh yes, of course. Just thinking about today's schedule. You know how it is." She offered him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, then quickly gathered her things and excused herself to prepare for her morning appointments. Charles watched her leave, a growing unease settling in his chest. In all their years together, through every crisis and triumph, Camilla had never been one to keep secrets from him. Their relationship was built on complete honesty, perhaps brutally so at times. They had both learned the devastating cost of deception from their previous relationships, and had sworn to each other that transparency would be the foundation of their marriage. As the day progressed, Charles found himself unable to concentrate on his usual duties. During a meeting with his private secretary about upcoming state visits, his mind wandered to Camilla's strange behavior. When his equerry briefed him on security arrangements for a charity gala, Charles found himself wondering why his wife had seemed so anxious about her phone. Even during his daily walk through the gardens of Clarence's house, a ritual that usually brought him peace and clarity, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The couple had developed certain routines over the years that helped them maintain their connection despite their demanding schedules. Tuesday evenings were sacred, a time when they would have dinner together without staff interruption, sharing stories from their day and discussing everything from family matters to global affairs. It was during these intimate moments that Charles felt most connected to the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. That evening, as they sat in the smaller dining room overlooking the garden, Charles decided to address his concerns directly. "Camilla, I couldn't help but notice you seemed rather preoccupied this morning. Is there something troubling you?" His wife paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, and for a moment Charles saw something flash across her face, fear, perhaps, or guilt. But it was gone so quickly he wondered if he had imagined it. "I've just been feeling overwhelmed lately," she said carefully. "The schedule has been quite intense, and I suppose I'm feeling my age more than I care to admit." Charles reached across the table and took her hand in his. "You know you can tell me anything, don't you? We've been through too much together to let anything come between us now." Camilla squeezed his hand and nodded, but Charles noticed that she avoided meeting his eyes. "Of course I know that. You're being silly, Charles. There's nothing wrong that a good night's sleep won't cure." Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, Charles observed his wife more carefully. She seemed to guard her phone jealously, keeping it close to her at all times and turning it face down whenever he was nearby. When it buzzed during her nighttime routine, she quickly glanced at it, and Charles caught a glimpse of relief washing over her features before she hastily deleted what appeared to be a message. Sleep eluded Charles that night. He lay beside his wife, listening to her breathing and wondering when their relationship had developed these small cracks that seemed to be widening daily. In the darkness, he replayed the events of recent weeks, searching for clues he might have missed. There had been unexplained absences, mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, and a general sense that Camilla was living a portion of her life that didn't include him. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Camilla continued with her royal duties, attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies, visiting schools, and hosting charity luncheons with her usual grace and professionalism. But Charles noticed that she was increasingly protective of her phone, often stepping away to take calls, and becoming visibly agitated when messages arrived during their time together. On Friday afternoon, Charles was in his study reviewing briefing papers for an upcoming Commonwealth meeting when his private secretary informed him that the Queen Consort had canceled her afternoon appointments due to a sudden headache. Concerned for her health, Charles decided to check on her personally. As he approached their private quarters, he could hear Camilla speaking in hushed tones on the phone. "No, we can't meet there again," she was saying, her voice barely audible through the heavy oak door. "Charles is becoming suspicious. We need to be more careful." Charles felt his blood run cold. The words hit him like a physical blow, confirming fears he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. He stood frozen in the corridor, his hand raised to knock on the door, as his wife continued her conversation. "I know it's difficult, but we have to think about what's at stake here. If this gets out, it won't just affect me. It will destroy everything we've worked for." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Charles found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, as the implications of what he had heard began to sink in. After everything they had been through together, after all their promises of honesty and transparency, Camilla was keeping secrets from him, secrets that involved other people and clandestine meetings. When the conversation finally ended, Charles quietly retreated to his study, his mind reeling with questions and possibilities. Who was she meeting? What was she hiding? And, most importantly, how long had this deception been going on? The man who had spent his entire life in the public eye, who understood better than anyone the devastating consequences of marital betrayal, now found himself on the other side of infidelity. As he sat alone in his study, surrounded by the symbols of his position and responsibility, Charles realized that his marriage, the relationship he had thought was unshakable, was built on foundations that were far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him as heavily as any crown, and he understood that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. That evening, Camilla appeared at dinner as if nothing had happened, chatting about her canceled appointments and expressing hope that her headache would be gone by morning. Charles played his part, responding appropriately to her small talk, while inside, he felt as though his world was crumbling. Every smile felt forced, every casual touch a betrayal, as he struggled to reconcile the woman sitting across from him with the person he had overheard making secretive phone calls. The weekend brought no relief. Charles found himself studying his wife's every move, looking for signs of deception, while simultaneously hoping he had misunderstood what he had heard. But Camilla's behavior only reinforced his growing suspicions. She was jumpy, distracted, and increasingly protective of her privacy in ways that were completely out of character. On Sunday evening, as they prepared for another week of royal duties, Charles made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed over decades of public life. He would find out what Camilla was hiding, even if it meant invading her privacy in ways that felt fundamentally wrong to him. The alternative, living with uncertainty and suspicion, was simply unbearable. Monday morning brought its usual flurry of activity. Charles had early meetings with government ministers, while Camilla was scheduled to visit a new cancer treatment center in Surrey. As she prepared to leave, gathering her handbag and adjusting her hat in the hallway mirror, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Charles watched as her face changed, becoming alert and almost fearful. "I need to take this," she said, stepping into a nearby anteroom and closing the door behind her. Charles stood in the hallway, his heart pounding as he realized this might be his opportunity to finally understand what was happening. When Camilla's voice rose slightly, not enough for him to make out words, but enough to indicate the intensity of the conversation, he knew he couldn't let this moment pass. As the sounds of the phone call continued from behind the closed door, Charles made a choice that would change everything. He decided that after 20 years of marriage, after everything they had promised each other about honesty and trust, he deserved to know what was threatening their relationship. The man who had spent his entire life maintaining dignity and protocol was about to cross a line that would fundamentally alter the course of their marriage. The weight of this decision settled over him as he prepared to take action that would either ease his fears or confirm his worst suspicions. Either way, Charles knew that by the end of this day, nothing would ever be the same between him and the woman he had loved for most of his life. The opportunity Charles had been both dreading and anticipating arrived unexpectedly on Tuesday afternoon. Camilla had returned from her Surrey engagement in an unusually flustered state, immediately retreating to their private bathroom for what she claimed was a much-needed bath after a long day. In her haste, she had left her phone charging on the nightstand, something that never happened. In 20 years of marriage, Charles had never seen his wife separated from her device for more than a few minutes. Charles stood in their bedroom doorway, listening to the sound of running water and Camilla's movements in the adjoining bathroom. Her phone sat innocently on the mahogany nightstand, its black screen reflecting the late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. For several minutes, he remained frozen, caught between his desperate need to know the truth and his fundamental belief in privacy and trust within marriage. The internal battle raged within him as he remembered their wedding vows, spoken in the presence of family and close friends at Windsor Guildhall. They had promised to love and honor each other, to be faithful in good times and bad. But what did those promises mean if one person was keeping secrets that potentially threatened everything they had built together? As he took a step toward the nightstand, Charles's mind filled with memories of their courtship, their struggles, and their eventual triumph over public opinion and personal obstacles. He thought about the nights they had spent talking until dawn about their dreams and fears, the way Camilla had stood by him during the most difficult periods of his life, and how she had gradually won the hearts of the British people through her genuine warmth and dedication to duty. But those memories were now tainted by the conversations he had overheard, the secretive phone calls, and the growing distance he felt between them. The woman who had once shared everything with him was now living portions of her life in shadows, and Charles found himself questioning whether he truly knew his wife at all. The sound of Camilla humming softly in the bath made his decision for him. His hand trembling slightly, Charles picked up the phone. The device was protected by a passcode, but Charles knew the numbers well, their wedding anniversary, April 9, 2005. As the screen unlocked, revealing Camilla's organized home screen with its carefully arranged apps and family photos, Charles felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He was violating the most basic trust between spouses, crossing a line he had never imagined he would cross. But it was too late to turn back now. With methodical precision born from years of handling sensitive documents and classified information, Charles began to examine his wife's digital life. Her email inbox contained the usual correspondence, messages from her private secretary about upcoming engagements, thank you notes from charities she had visited, and communications from various organizations seeking her patronage. The text messages initially appeared equally innocent. Exchanges with their children, conversations with old friends, and coordination with staff members about schedules and logistics. But as Charles scrolled deeper into the message history, his heart began to race. There, buried among the mundane communications, was a thread of messages with someone listed simply as M. Messages that painted a picture Charles was unprepared to see. The most recent exchange had taken place that very morning, just hours before Camilla's visit to the cancer center. The messages were brief, but intimate in a way that made Charles's stomach lurch. Can't stop thinking about yesterday, read one message from him. Camilla's response was equally troubling. Neither can I. But we have to be more careful. C is starting to notice. Charles sank into the bedroom chair, the phone trembling in his hands as he scrolled through weeks of similar exchanges. The messages revealed a relationship that had been developing for months, filled with references to secret meetings, shared moments, and an emotional intimacy that Charles had believed was reserved exclusively for him. The way you looked at me during the ceremony, read one message from several weeks earlier. I thought my heart would stop. Camilla's reply had been swift and revealing. It's getting harder to pretend. Every public event, every official function, I find myself looking for you in the crowd. The messages painted a picture of two people struggling with feelings they knew were inappropriate, trying to maintain professional boundaries while being drawn together by an attraction they couldn't resist. Charles read about clandestine coffee meetings disguised as official business, stolen moments in empty conference rooms, and the growing emotional attachment that was clearly threatening both of their marriages. As he continued reading, Charles discovered that M was someone within their professional circle, someone who attended many of the same events, who had legitimate reasons to be in regular contact with Camilla, and who had apparently been slowly winning his wife's heart, while Charles remained obliviously focused on his royal duties. One message thread from the previous week revealed the extent of Camilla's internal struggle. "I never meant for this to happen," she had written. "Charles and I have been through so much together. He doesn't deserve this." M's response had been understanding but persistent. "I know this is complicated, but what we have is real. You can't deny that." "I'm not denying it," Camilla had replied. "That's what makes it so frightening." Charles set the phone down, his hands shaking as the full implications of what he had discovered began to sink in. This wasn't a simple physical affair. It was an emotional betrayal that cut far deeper than any sexual indiscretion could have. His wife was falling in love with someone else, someone who understood her in ways that perhaps Charles no longer did. The sound of water draining from the bathtub snapped Charles back to the present moment. In a few minutes, Camilla would emerge from the bathroom, and he would have to face her with the knowledge of what he had discovered. The man who had spent his life maintaining composure in the most challenging circumstances now found himself completely unprepared for this personal crisis. As he heard Camilla moving around in the bathroom, Charles quickly returned the phone to its original position on the nightstand and retreated to his study. He needed time to process what he had learned, to decide how to confront his wife about her betrayal without revealing how he had obtained the information. 20 minutes later, Camilla appeared in his study doorway, dressed in casual clothes with her hair still damp from her bath. She looked relaxed and refreshed, a stark contrast to the anxiety and guilt Charles was now certain he could see lurking behind her eyes. "Feeling better, my dear?" Charles asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil raging inside him. "Much better, thank you," Camilla replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I was thinking we might have dinner in tonight, just the two of us. It feels like we haven't had a proper conversation in weeks." The irony of her suggestion wasn't lost on Charles. Here was his wife, fresh from bathing away the evidence of whatever emotional or physical encounter she had experienced that day, suggesting they spend quality time together while conducting a secret affair that was threatening the very foundation of their marriage. "That sounds lovely," Charles replied, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "Perhaps we could discuss what's been keeping you so busy lately." He watched Camilla's face carefully as he spoke, looking for any sign of guilt or recognition. For just a moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or the awareness that her husband was beginning to see through her carefully constructed facade. "Oh, you know how it is," she said with forced lightness. "Charity work never ends, and there are always new causes that need attention." "Indeed," Charles said quietly. "Some causes seem to require more personal attention than others." This time, Camilla's reaction was unmistakable. Her face went pale, and she gripped the arms of her chair as if steadying herself. "What do you mean by that?" Charles leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's face as he formulated his response. The moment had arrived sooner than he had anticipated, but perhaps it was better this way. The secrets and suspicions had been poisoning their relationship for weeks, and continuing to pretend ignorance would only make the eventual confrontation more painful for both of them. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Camilla," he said softly. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's really been occupying your time and attention lately." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles could see his wife's mind racing, probably trying to determine how much he knew and how much she could safely admit without completely destroying their marriage. It was a calculation he recognized from his own experience with marital deception, and the familiarity of it made his heart ache. "Charles, Camilla began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words that could adequately explain or justify what she had been doing. "Let me make this easier for you," Charles said, his voice gaining strength as he prepared to reveal what he had discovered. "I know about the messages, Camilla. I know about the meetings, the secret phone calls, and the person you've been seeing behind my back." Camilla's face crumpled as if she had been physically struck. For a moment, Charles saw past the composed, dignified queen consort to the frightened woman beneath, someone who had been caught in a web of deception that had grown far beyond her ability to control or contain. "How long have you known?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Long enough, Charles replied. Long enough to understand that our marriage is in serious trouble, and long enough to realize that whatever is happening between you and this other person has progressed far beyond anything that could be dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment. Camilla buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with what Charles realized were tears. Despite his anger and hurt, seeing his wife in such distress awakened protective instincts that had been dormant for months. I never meant for this to happen, she said through her tears. You have to believe me, Charles. It just evolved so gradually that I didn't realize how deep it had become until it was too late. Tell me about him, Charles said quietly. Tell me about this person who has become so important to you that you're willing to risk everything we've built together. Camilla looked up at him, her eyes red and filled with a pain that was clearly genuine. His name is Marcus, she said slowly. He's been working with several of my charities for the past 2 years. He's dedicated, intelligent, and passionate about the causes he supports. At first, it was purely professional. But it didn't stay that way, Charles observed. No, Camilla admitted. Somewhere along the way, professional respect became personal friendship, and friendship became something more. I tried to maintain boundaries, Charles. I really did. But he understands parts of me that I thought no one else could see. The admission hit Charles like a physical blow. After 20 years of marriage, his wife was telling him that a relative stranger understood her better than he did. The implications of that revelation would have been devastating under any circumstances, but coming in the context of an emotional affair, it felt like the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. And what exactly does Marcus understand about you that I don't? Charles asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. He sees the woman I am when I'm not trying to be the perfect queen consort, she finally said. He knows the person I was before all of this royal protocol and public scrutiny. With him, I can just be Camilla. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond a simple extramarital attraction. Charles realized that his wife wasn't just having an affair. She was escaping from their life together, finding in another man a refuge from the responsibilities and expectations that defined their marriage. As the evening shadows began to lengthen across his study, Charles understood that this conversation was only the beginning. The discovery of Camilla's betrayal had opened wounds that would require far more than a simple apology to heal, and the road ahead would test both of them in ways they had never imagined possible. The revelation about Marcus hung between Charles and Camilla like a poisonous cloud, contaminating every word they had spoken to each other over the past months. Charles found himself replaying countless interactions, searching for signs he had missed, moments when his wife's attention had been elsewhere, explanations for her distracted behavior that now made perfect sense in this new context. How long? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How long has this been going on? Camilla wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so vulnerable and human that it momentarily softened Charles's anger. The feelings started developing about 6 months ago, she admitted. But we didn't act on them until recently. Define act on them, Charles said, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for the answer. We've kissed, Camilla said quietly, her gaze fixed on her hands. A few times. And we've talked about what it might mean, what we might want if circumstances were different. Charles felt a wave of relief mixed with devastation. Physical betrayal would have been easier to categorize, easier to either forgive or condemn outright. But this emotional infidelity, this slow drift toward another person while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage, felt more insidious and somehow more personal. Where, he asked. When you were supposedly at charity events? Sometimes, Camilla nodded. He would arrange to be at the same functions, or we would meet afterward for coffee. We told ourselves it was work-related, that we were discussing strategy for various initiatives. And the phone calls. The text messages I heard you trying to hide. He would call when he knew you were in meetings, she explained. We talked about everything, his work, my frustrations with royal protocol, our shared interests in literature and conservation. It felt so natural, Charles. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to someone who saw me as more than just a title or a role. Charles stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the gardens where he and Camilla had walked together countless times over the years. And what am I then? He asked, his back to his wife. What have I been to you all these years if not someone who sees you for who you truly are? The silence stretched on for so long that Charles began to wonder if Camilla had left the room. When he finally turned around, he found her watching him with an expression of profound sadness. "You are the king," she said finally. "And I am the queen consort. Even when we're alone, even in our most private moments, those roles are always there. We can never completely escape what we represent, the weight of responsibility we carry, the expectations placed upon us." "That's an excuse, not an explanation," Charles said, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized the truth in what she was saying. Their relationship had evolved over 2 decades from passionate love affair to institutional partnership, with each passing year bringing new duties, new constraints, and fewer opportunities for the kind of spontaneous intimacy they had once shared. "Is it?" Camilla asked, rising from her chair to face him directly. "When was the last time we talked about something that didn't involve schedules, state affairs, or family obligations? When did we last spend time together without thinking about how our actions might be perceived by the press or the public?" Charles opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as he realized he couldn't remember. Their conversations had indeed become increasingly focused on logistics and duty, with little room for the personal disclosure and emotional intimacy that had characterized their early relationship. "That doesn't justify what you've done," he said finally. "If you were unhappy, if you felt disconnected from our marriage, you should have talked to me about it." "Should I have?" Camilla challenged. "Charles, your entire life is scheduled down to the minute. Between your official duties, your environmental advocacy, and your family responsibilities, when exactly would I have found time for a conversation about my emotional needs?" The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. Charles had indeed become increasingly absorbed in his royal duties, particularly as the weight of kingship had settled fully on his shoulders. He had assumed that Camilla was adapting to their new roles with the same sense of duty and sacrifice that had guided his own approach to royal life. "I never realized you felt so isolated," he admitted, returning to his chair. "I thought we were adjusting to our new responsibilities together." "We were," Camilla said, settling back into her own chair. "But somewhere along the way, I started feeling like I was disappearing into the role. The woman I used to be, the one who loved riding horses across the countryside, who read voraciously, who could spend hours in passionate conversation about books and ideas. She started to feel like someone from another lifetime." Charles studied his wife's face, seeing clearly for the first time in months the exhaustion and longing he had been too busy to notice. "And Marcus makes you feel like that woman again?" "Yes," Camilla said simply. "With him, I can talk about poetry for hours without worrying about whether it's an appropriate use of my time. I can share my opinion about literature without considering how it might be interpreted by the press. I can be spontaneous and silly and human." "You can be all of those things with me," Charles protested, though even as he spoke, he wondered if it was true. Had their relationship become so formalized, so constrained by protocol and expectation, that there was no longer room for the kind of authentic connection Camilla was describing? "Can I?" Camilla asked gently. "Charles, I love you. I've loved you for most of my adult life, and I never questioned that love until recently. But I've started to wonder if what we have now is really a marriage or just a very successful professional partnership." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had spent so much energy focusing on the betrayal, on the violation of trust represented by Camilla's relationship with Marcus, that he hadn't considered the possibility that their marriage might have fundamental problems that predated her affair. "Tell me about him," Charles said after a long pause. "Not the work he does or the causes he supports, but who he is as a person." Camilla looked surprised by the request, but after a moment she began to speak. "He's 52, divorced, with 2 adult children who live in Scotland. He grew up on a farm in Devon, which is where his passion for environmental conservation began. He reads everything: fiction, poetry, scientific journals, philosophical texts. He can quote Yeats from memory and discuss climate policy with equal enthusiasm." Charles noticed how Camilla's face softened as she spoke about Marcus, how her voice took on a warmth that he hadn't heard directed toward him in months. It was painful to witness, but it also helped him understand the depth of his wife's feelings for this other man. "He sounds like someone you would have been attracted to even if you had met him before we married," Charles observed. "Perhaps," Camilla admitted. "But I didn't meet him before we married. I met him now, when I needed someone to remind me who I used to be. And what does he want from you? What does he hope will happen between you?" Camilla was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "He knows our situation is impossible," she finally said. "He's not asking me to leave you or to abandon my responsibilities. But He's made it clear that he loves me, and that he would be willing to accept whatever relationship we could have within the constraints of my position. A long-term affair, in other words, Charles said flatly. I suppose that's what it would be, Camilla admitted, though we've been calling it an emotional connection that might never fully be consummated. Charles laughed bitterly. How very noble of you both. Don't, Camilla said sharply. Don't diminish what I'm feeling by making it sound sordid or calculating. This isn't about excitement or rebellion or any of the cliches about middle-aged women having affairs. This is about feeling truly seen and appreciated by another person. But it is an affair, Camilla, Charles pointed out. Emotional, physical, or otherwise, you're sharing intimate parts of yourself with someone who isn't your husband, and you're doing it secretly. The motivation doesn't change the fundamental betrayal. Camilla nodded sadly. I know, and I know how hypocritical it must sound, coming from someone who once encouraged you to have an honest conversation about your marriage to Diana instead of conducting a secret affair. The reference to his first marriage was like salt in an open wound. Charles had spent decades living with the consequences of his affair with Camilla during his marriage to Diana, understanding all too well the devastating impact that infidelity could have on everyone involved. The fact that Camilla was now putting him in the position Diana had once occupied felt like cosmic justice of the cruelest kind. I keep thinking about Diana, Charles said quietly, about how she felt when she discovered our relationship, about the pain and humiliation she experienced because of choices we made. I think about her too, Camilla replied. And I think about how we promised each other that our marriage would be different, that we would never put each other through what we had experienced before. Yet here we are, Charles said. Yes, Camilla agreed. Here we are. The room fell silent as both of them contemplated the wreckage of their marriage and the impossible choices that lay ahead. Charles understood that this conversation was far from over, that they would need to make decisions about their future that would affect not only their personal happiness, but also the stability of the monarchy and the British people's faith in their institutions. As the evening shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared in the sky outside his study windows, Charles realized that his life had reached another crossroads. The choices he made in the coming days would determine not only the fate of his marriage, but also his legacy as a king and as a man. The weight of that responsibility settled over him like a familiar burden, even as his personal world crumbled around him. What do you want, Camilla? He asked finally. Not what you think you should want, or what would be best for the monarchy, but what you actually want for your life. Camilla looked at him for a long moment before answering. I want to feel alive again, she said simply. I want to be more than just a symbol or a duty. I want to be a woman who is loved for who she is, not what she represents. And you don't feel that with me anymore? I don't know, Camilla said honestly. I'm not sure I remember what that felt like with you. It's been so long since we were just Charles and Camilla instead of the king and queen consort. Charles nodded slowly, understanding for the first time that saving their marriage would require more than simply ending Camilla's relationship with Marcus. They would need to rebuild their connection from the ground up, rediscovering the people they had been before duty and protocol had shaped every aspect of their lives together. The question was whether they still had the time, energy, and emotional capacity for such a fundamental transformation, especially while carrying the weight of their public responsibilities. The days following Camilla's confession passed in a surreal haze of maintained normalcy and underlying devastation. Charles found himself going through the motions of royal life, attending state functions, reviewing government papers, meeting with advisors, while internally grappling with the collapse of everything he had believed about his marriage. The public facade required by their positions meant that neither he nor Camilla could retreat from their obligations to process their personal crisis, creating an additional layer of stress that made every interaction feel artificial and exhausting. Wednesday morning brought a scheduled joint appearance at the opening of a new children's hospital in London. As they traveled in the royal car, Charles and Camilla sat in silence, both staring out opposite windows at the gray autumn landscape. The easy conversation that had once characterized their public appearances together had been replaced by an awkward tension that Charles worried might be visible to observers. We need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation publicly, Charles said as they approached the hospital. Whatever decisions we make about our marriage, we can't allow our personal problems to affect our public duties. Camilla nodded without looking at him. Of course, I would never do anything to harm the monarchy or compromise your position as king. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on either of them. By conducting an emotional affair, Camilla was already doing exactly what she claimed she would never do, creating a situation that could potentially destabilize the royal family if it became public knowledge. As they emerged from the car to the sound of cheering crowds and clicking cameras, Charles and Camilla seamlessly transformed into their public personas. They smiled, shook hands, accepted flowers from children, and delivered prepared remarks about the importance of pediatric healthcare with the professionalism that had made them one of the most effective royal couples in recent history. But Charles found himself studying Camilla throughout the event, looking for signs of the woman who had been secretly meeting with Marcus, searching for evidence of the emotional distance she had described. What he saw was troubling in its familiarity. Camilla was performing her role flawlessly, but there was a hollowness behind her eyes that suggested she was operating on autopilot, disconnected from the genuine enthusiasm she had once brought to such events. During a private moment while touring the hospital's pediatric oncology ward, Charles observed Camilla interacting with a young patient who was showing her a drawing he had made. For the first time in days, Charles saw a flash of authentic emotion cross his wife's face, genuine warmth and compassion that reminded him of why he had fallen in love with her decades earlier. She's still in there, he thought to himself. The woman I married is still in there, buried under layers of duty and disappointment. That evening, they attended a state dinner at Buckingham Palace honoring the visiting Prime Minister of Canada. The formal dinner required them to sit together, exchange pleasantries with guests, and maintain the appearance of a harmonious partnership. Charles found the evening excruciating, particularly when well-meaning guests complimented them on their strong marriage and the example they set for the country. Your Majesties have shown us all that true love can overcome any obstacle, the Canadian Prime Minister's wife remarked during the reception. Your love story gives hope to anyone who believes in second chances. Charles and Camilla exchanged a brief glance across the conversation circle, each recognizing the bitter irony of the comment. Their love story, which had indeed overcome tremendous obstacles during their courtship and early marriage, was now facing challenges that might prove insurmountable. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in their shared quarters, the weight of maintaining their public facade finally overwhelmed Camilla. Charles found her sitting on the edge of their bed, still wearing her evening gown, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this much longer, she whispered. Pretending that everything is normal, accepting congratulations on our marriage when I know how badly I've damaged it. The guilt is eating me alive. Charles sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to touch her without invitation. The guilt should tell you something important about your character, he said gently. Someone who truly didn't care about our marriage wouldn't be suffering the way you are. But that almost makes it worse, Camilla replied. If I were simply a callous person having a thoughtless affair, it would be easier to dismiss my actions as character flaws. Instead, I'm someone who loves you but who got lost somewhere along the way and made terrible choices that have hurt the person I care about most. Charles felt a flicker of hope at her words, even as he recognized that loving someone and being able to maintain a successful marriage with them were not necessarily the same thing. Tell me about the first time you realized you were developing feelings for Marcus, he said. I need to understand how this began. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. It was at the literacy gala in May, she said finally. He was there representing one of the smaller organizations we work with, and during the cocktail reception, we started talking about a book we had both recently read, a biography of Virginia Woolf. The conversation went on for nearly an hour, and I found myself completely absorbed in his insights and perspectives. That doesn't sound particularly romantic, Charles observed. It wasn't, Camilla agreed. But it was the first time in months that I had talked about something I was passionate about with someone who shared that passion and could engage with me on an intellectual level without any agenda or ulterior motive. Charles felt a stab of recognition and guilt. He tried to remember the last time he and Camilla had talked about books or literature, subjects that had once been central to their connection. He couldn't recall a single conversation of that nature in recent memory, their discussions having become increasingly focused on schedules, duties, and logistical concerns. What happened after that, he asked. Nothing, initially, Camilla said. But over the following weeks, I found myself looking forward to events where I knew he would be present. I started suggesting that certain organizations be included in functions because I knew he would be their representative. I told myself it was because he was intelligent and well-informed, that having him at events elevated the intellectual quality of the conversations. When did you realize you were rationalizing? Charles asked. When I started choosing my outfits based on whether he would see me in them, Camilla admitted, her face flushing with embarrassment. When I found myself checking my appearance in mirrors before events where I knew he would be present. When I started looking forward to seeing him more than I looked forward to coming home to you. The admission was painful for both of them, but Charles appreciated his wife's honesty. Understanding the progression of her feelings, the gradual way they had developed and deepened, helped him comprehend how someone as fundamentally loyal as Camilla could have found herself in such a situation. And when did the relationship become physical? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. 3 weeks ago, Camilla said quietly. After the environmental conference in Edinburgh, we had dinner together to discuss follow-up strategies for several initiatives. And when he walked me back to my hotel, we kissed goodnight in the elevator. Charles tried to process this information objectively, but the image of his wife sharing intimate moments with another man was almost unbearable. And since then? We've met twice more, Camilla said. Once at a small cafe in Kensington after I visited the women's shelter, and once at his office when I was supposedly reviewing grant applications. Both times we kissed, and both times we talked about what we were feeling and what it might mean. What conclusions did you reach? Charles asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to know the answer. That we cared deeply for each other, but that we're both terrified of the implications, Camilla replied. Marcus has no desire to destroy my marriage or compromise my position. He's told me repeatedly that he would be content with whatever relationship we could have, even if it meant rarely seeing each other and never being able to acknowledge our feelings publicly. And what did you tell him? That I didn't know what I wanted, Camilla said honestly. That I was confused and guilty, but also happier than I had been in years. That I needed time to figure out what was happening to me and what it might mean for our marriage. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that had become his refuge during times of stress and uncertainty. The question now is whether there's a path forward for us that doesn't require you to choose between your marriage and your happiness. Is there? Camilla asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like those two things have become mutually exclusive. Charles turned back to face his wife, seeing her clearly for the first time in months. Not as the queen consort or the dutiful royal wife, but as a woman who was struggling with profound loneliness and the gradual erosion of her sense of self. I think there might be, he said carefully, but it would require both of us to make fundamental changes to how we approach our marriage and our roles. It would mean prioritizing our relationship in ways we haven't done in years, creating space for the people we used to be underneath all the titles and responsibilities. And what about Marcus? Camilla asked. Marcus would have to become part of our past, Charles said firmly. Not because I'm demanding it as some kind of ultimatum, but because rebuilding our marriage would be impossible while you're emotionally invested in someone else. Camilla nodded slowly, though Charles could see the pain in her eyes at the prospect of ending her relationship with the man who had reawakened feelings she had thought were lost forever. I need to think about whether I'm capable of that, she said honestly, and whether it would be fair to either of us to try to rebuild something that might be fundamentally broken. Charles sat back down beside her, this time taking her hand in his. 20 years ago, we believed our love could overcome anything, he said. We fought the press, public opinion, and our own families to be together. The question is whether we still have that kind of fight left in us, and whether what we're fighting for is worth the effort it would require. As they sat together in their bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of power and privilege that had shaped their lives for decades, Charles and Camilla both understood that they were facing the most important decision of their marriage. The choices they made in the coming days would determine not only their personal happiness, but also their legacy as a couple and as public figures who had spent their lives in service to others. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the genuine love they still felt for each other despite the damage that had been done, made their situation both heartbreaking and hopeful in equal measure. They had reached a crossroads that would require courage, honesty, and a willingness to risk everything they had built together in pursuit of something that might not even be possible to reclaim. The conversation that would determine the future of their marriage took place on a gray Thursday morning in Charles's private study at Clarence House. Both Charles and Camilla had spent the previous night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and contemplating the impossible choices that lay before them. The weight of 20 years together, the expectations of a nation, and the genuine love that still existed beneath all the hurt and betrayal created a complex web of considerations that neither of them was fully prepared to navigate. Camilla entered the study carrying 2 cups of tea, a gesture that reminded Charles of countless mornings during their courtship when such simple acts of consideration had been the foundation of their growing intimacy. She set his cup on the desk and settled into the chair across from him, her posture conveying both determination and vulnerability. "I've made a decision about Marcus," she said without preamble. "But before I tell you what it is, I need you to understand that this choice isn't being made because of threats or ultimatums or even guilt about what I've done. It's being made because I finally understand what I really want." Charles held his breath, uncertain whether her words would bring relief or devastation. "Tell me," he said simply. "I'm going to end it," Camilla said firmly. "Not because you've demanded it, but because I've realized that what I was looking for with Marcus was never really about him. It was about finding parts of myself that I thought I had lost, parts that I assumed could only be recovered through a relationship with someone who didn't know me primarily as the queen consort." Charles felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed immediately by uncertainty about what this decision would mean for their marriage going forward. "What changed your mind?" he asked. "Our conversation last night," Camilla replied. "When you asked me about the first time I realized I was developing feelings for Marcus, I started thinking about what had attracted me to him in the first place. It wasn't his physical appearance or even his personality, as wonderful as both of those things are. It was the way he listened to me talk about books and ideas without checking his watch or steering the conversation toward more appropriate topics." Charles winced at the implicit criticism, recognizing the truth in her observation. "I used to listen to you that way," he said quietly. "Yes, you did," Camilla agreed. "For hours at a time, during those long phone calls when we were courting, during lazy Sunday mornings in the early years of our marriage. You used to be fascinated by my thoughts and opinions, not just my willingness to support your causes and attend your events. And you think we can find our way back to that?" Charles asked. "I think we have to try," Camilla said. "Because the alternative is to accept that our marriage has become nothing more than a successful professional partnership. And I'm not ready to settle for that if there's any possibility of reclaiming what we once had." Charles reached across the desk and took his wife's hand. "It won't be easy," he warned. "We've fallen into patterns of behavior and communication that will be difficult to change. And we'll have to do it while maintaining all of our public responsibilities and dealing with the stress of your ending things with Marcus." "I know," Camilla said. "But, Charles, for the first time in months, I feel hopeful about us. Not because I'm ending my relationship with Marcus, but because I finally believe you want to fight for our marriage as much as I do." The next several hours were spent planning how Camilla would handle her final meeting with Marcus and how they would begin the process of rebuilding their relationship. They agreed that complete honesty would be essential, even when it was painful, and that they would need to create new routines and traditions that prioritize their connection as husband and wife over their duties as king and queen consort. "I want to schedule regular time for just the two of us," Charles said. "Not state dinners or official functions, but actual dates where we can rediscover who we are together when we're not performing our roles. And I want to share my reading with you again," Camilla added. "I want to discuss books and ideas and have the kind of intellectual conversations that used to keep us up all night." "What about travel?" Charles suggested. "We could plan some private getaways, just short trips where we can be anonymous and focus entirely on each other." As they talked, both Charles and Camilla began to feel something they hadn't experienced in months: excitement about their future together. The conversation revealed how much they had missed the intimate connection that had characterized their early relationship, and how much they both wanted to reclaim it. That afternoon, Camilla met Marcus at a small restaurant in Notting Hill, far from the usual haunts of royal watchers and gossip columnists. She had chosen the location carefully, wanting privacy for what she knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of her life. Marcus was waiting for her when she arrived, his face lighting up with the kind of genuine pleasure that had become so precious to her over the past months. But as soon as he saw her expression, his smile faded. "You're ending this," he said before she could speak. "Yes," Camilla said, settling into the chair across from him. "But not for the reasons you might think." She explained her decision honestly, telling Marcus about her conversations with Charles and their mutual commitment to rebuilding their marriage. She spoke about her realization that what she had been seeking with him was not really about him at all, but about rediscovering parts of herself that had become buried under years of royal protocol and public expectation. "I don't regret what we've shared," she told him. These past months have reminded me of who I am underneath all the titles and responsibilities, and that knowledge will make me a better wife and a better person. But I can't continue our relationship while trying to rebuild my marriage. It wouldn't be fair to any of us. Marcus listened without interruption, his face reflecting the pain of losing someone he had come to love deeply. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long time before responding. "I understand," he said finally. "And, as much as it hurts to hear, I respect your decision. You've never made any promises to me about leaving Charles or choosing me over your marriage. I always knew this was a possibility. You're an extraordinary man," Camilla said, tears threatening to overflow. "In another life, under different circumstances, things might have been different between us. But this is the life we have," Marcus replied with sad acceptance. "And you're making the choice that's right for you and for the people who depend on you." They talked for another hour, sharing memories of their time together and acknowledging the genuine connection they had developed. When it came time to leave, they embraced briefly, both understanding that it would likely be their last intimate contact. "Be happy," Marcus whispered as they parted. "Whatever happens with your marriage, make sure you don't lose the woman I've come to know and love." That evening, Camilla returned to Clarence's house emotionally drained, but somehow lighter than she had felt in months. The weight of deception and divided loyalties had been lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a clear sense of purpose about rebuilding her relationship with Charles. She found her husband in the garden, walking among the roses they had planted together in the early years of their marriage. The sight of him moving slowly among the flowers, his shoulders bent with the weight of recent stress, reminded her of all the reasons she had fallen in love with him decades earlier. "How did it go?" Charles asked when he saw her approaching. "It's done," Camilla said simply. "I told him about our decision to work on our marriage, and I made it clear that I won't be seeing him again outside of any unavoidable professional contexts." Charles stopped walking and turned to face his wife fully. "How do you feel?" "Sad," Camilla admitted, "but also relieved and hopeful about us in a way I haven't been for a long time." They stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the scent of late-blooming roses and the familiar comfort of their shared home. For the first time in months, the silence between them was comfortable rather than tense, filled with possibility rather than recrimination. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," Charles said, taking Camilla's hand as they continued their walk through the garden. "Yes, we do," Camilla agreed. "But for the first time since this whole situation began, I believe we can do it." Over the following weeks, Charles and Camilla began the slow, careful process of rebuilding their marriage. They scheduled regular dinner dates without any discussion of royal business, planned weekend retreats where they could focus entirely on each other, and gradually rediscovered the intellectual and emotional intimacy that had been the foundation of their original connection. The process was not without setbacks and difficult moments. There were evenings when old patterns of communication reasserted themselves, times when the demands of royal life threatened to overwhelm their personal priorities, and moments when both of them questioned whether they were capable of sustaining the changes they were trying to make. But there were also breakthrough moments, conversations that lasted until dawn, shared laughter over private jokes, and the gradual return of physical intimacy that reflected their growing emotional reconnection. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild not just their marriage but their individual sense of identity within that marriage. 6 months later, as they prepared for a state visit to Australia, Charles and Camilla reflected on how far they had traveled together since that devastating Thursday morning when their marriage had seemed irreparably damaged. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had ultimately forced them to confront fundamental problems in their relationship and to make changes that had strengthened their bond in ways neither of them had anticipated. They had learned that love alone was not enough to sustain a marriage under the extraordinary pressures of royal life, but that love combined with intentionality, commitment, and the willingness to prioritize their relationship over convenience or habit could overcome even the most serious challenges. As they boarded the plane that would take them to Sydney, Charles and Camilla exchanged a look that conveyed their shared understanding of how close they had come to losing everything and how grateful they were to have found their way back to each other. Their marriage had been tested in ways they never could have imagined, but it had emerged stronger and more authentic than it had been in years. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with the usual challenges and responsibilities of royal life, but also with a renewed sense of partnership and intimacy that had made all their sacrifices worthwhile. They had proven to themselves and to each other that their love story was not finished, that there were still chapters to be written together, and that the commitment they had made to each other 20 years earlier remained as vital and meaningful as ever.